Hi, this is Amber Young,
And this is Barbara Phillips.
and this is
Let's
Let's Talk
talk
EVM.
EVM.
Welcome, everyone, to our podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy and continue to listen with us or go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. I will start this episode with a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is stated for myself and Barbara.
Thank you.
And the disclaimer is that all of the opinions that are expressed on this podcast are our own and they are not the opinions of the United States government. So, with that, today we do not have a soapbox moment. I'm sure there will be conversations throughout, but no Barbara soapbox moment today.
Yeah.
Instead, we're going to go straight to our guest. He is an esteemed guest that I've worked very closely with for many years. So, highly regarded in my book and in the industry. We have Jim Henderson. And our topic with him today is that challenges remain. So there's a lot we're going to hear about EVM history. So Jim, with that, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Again, my name is Jim Henderson. I am currently semi-retired, which means I work part-time every now and then. Try not to take full-time jobs. But my world in EVM basically started as a captain in the Air Force about 40 years ago, with my first EVM experience working as a cost analyst for an Air Force program office at Hanscom Air Force Base, Massachusetts. And then about after 2 years, I joined the comptroller as a CSCSC review chief in training under an experienced woman mentor in various roles, including assistant team chief and the whole gamut of area leads. I spent 2 years doing that, and then my next assignment, I moved to Redondo Beach, California, LA Air Force Base, and so that's in your neighborhood, Amber.
Yes, old neighborhood. Yes,
old neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked as the cost schedule surveillance chief at TRW One Space Park in Redondo Beach. Later becoming the program and technical support lead, and that was under Defense Logistics Agency, because what happened was we were part of Contract Management Division with the Air Force, but all the services get consolidated under the Defense Logistics Agency, and these are all the plant representative offices. So but I wanted to continue my career in the Air Force doing EVM related stuff, which when I said CSCSC, that's Cost Schedule Control Systems Criteria.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Thank you for defining
Yes,
acronyms.
thank you.
Amber and I are trying to get better at that. Yeah.
Right,
Thank
right.
you.
That was just rattled off your tongue. I like
Yeah,
that.
really. Yeah.
So,
Impressive.
and so I did that. Again, I was I think my experiences as a review chief in training gave me a heads up to go ahead and work with one of the contractors that had been validated 3 times, devalidated twice.
Wow.
Wow.
And so they were pretty advanced in not only their processes and controls, but also the fact that they had an organization, an internal organization that exclusively, did internal surveillance. And so when I got there, I did joint surveillance with them, and that was an eye opener. It worked very well. They had 14 major contracts and about 35 smaller contracts that all required. We'll call it EVM from now on, all right, instead of CSCSC. So that was a very interesting time, and that time was from 1989 to about the end of 92. Okay, so I spent 3 years there, and that was a
TRW. So wait, I'm confused, Jim. You were still in the military, or you were a private?
No, I was a captain in the Air Force.
So
was
you're a captain in the Air Force assigned
first
to TRW?
assigned to, it was under Contract Management Division, and it was
DLA.
an Air Force plant representative office.
Oh, okay. Plant rep. Okay. Nice.
So,
Okay.
so the services were the representatives at these service pros, is what we
Right.
used to call it.
Right. Okay. You're on
And
set.
and as a service pro, you would report back. But this one was, since it, APRO TRW they had all the services represented there. And it had CIA and NASA and some of the other intelligence agencies, which I'm not going to mention here, but it was really interesting in that TRW was implementing one system on all these different for all these different programs, services, and agencies. So it gave me that perspective, and I'll get into why that was important later and how that changed things. It was a very pivotal moment for me. What I did was, from a cost schedule branch chief to a program and technical support lead, working with what they called kind of project officers that would represent different programs within that building. Right after that, DA-12 happened. When DLA came and consolidated all service operations under Defense Logistics Agency, they needed an EVM focal point.
Okay.
And I was probably the most experienced because of my team chief training. So I became the first Western District, which was all the states west of the Mississippi. They only had two districts, Eastern and Western District. And that was under my cognizance as the EVM focal point.
Well,
It's the first
Jim,
one.
can you expand a little bit on how the A-12 was a trigger?
Wait, we want to wait.
Isn't that what I
No.
just said? No,
I know,
am I
but
all right?
we're still on his bio. There's a lot more.
Oh,
That
Yeah,
was just the beginning.
So I could dive right into that, or I could just finish my bio real quick.
Finish bio.
Sorry,
Then we'll go back to Tato. Sorry, Barbara. I know you got excited
I
there.
spent 3 years there.
Oh, the dog. I told you. That's my soapbox moment. I have a dog in the house.
She's babysitting everyone. Doggy sitting.
The contracts that I supported was the MRUAV, the medium range unmanned aerial vehicle, which was a Navy contract, and it was down in San Diego,
Mm.
and it was under Teledyne Ryan Aeronautical, right next to the airport. So I used to travel down there a lot. The interesting thing about that was Naval Air Systems Command was, they had all these findings from a review that they conducted, and I helped them a lot in getting those issues resolved. And so they hired me on. When I left the Air Force as a captain, I went to the Naval Air Systems Command as a GS-14, and they had a Air Force and DoD hiring freeze, and they still hired me, and they got a waiver because they were like, we want you.
Nice.
Worked there for 10 years at Naval Air
Wow.
Systems Command, and I did various jobs, at Naval Air Systems Command. But that was also a pivotal moment for me because it gave me the other side of things, which was the analysis. And so I was a team lead in analysis, and then later became a branch head supervisor, and then finally an EVM focal point for Naval Air Systems Command. But they became a lead service. So the order of things was the Air Force was the lead service in EVM because they were the ones who brought this and introduced
Bowman Guide, right?
Then when services lost the cognizance for responsibility for reviews, and I'll get into that in just a moment, the Naval Air Systems Command hired all the team chiefs, the ex-team chiefs and review directors, and so we were probably, when that happened, we were probably the only procuring command that had a plethora of EVM experts.
Mm.
And we all learned the analysis, and we had a really good SES who was smart. She was brilliant. And so we all learned that part of it and how to support the program executive officers, which then had a line up to the Navy Secretary and as well as OSD. So that's a whole line going up the program office way. And
wow, that's a game changer. I mean, yeah, wow, to have that chain of command right before you, that must have been amazing.
Years of that, going through the whole IBR process and learning that. But the whole transition, and this is what's really interesting, came at the moment during that time that I served in LA as a captain. And so I'll get to that real soon. Spent 10 years at NavAir, and then I took a job at NASA. It was NASA EVM focal point that I took the job for. And they brought me in as a cost estimator / EVM focal point. So I had to learn cost estimating. And so
what year was that, Jim?
That was in 2003.
Okay.
And what the interesting thing that happened there was right before I got here, they had the Columbia accident.
Oh, yeah.
So my boss came up to me and said, "Do you still have a job?" And I said, "I think so."
Wow.
But, so I entered my job at NASA with, the umbrella of the Columbia accident.
Yeah.
And
Sad.
I still remember having a boss pounding his fists on his desk saying, "It was not the phone. It was not the external tank foam. I can tell you right now." And boy, he was proven wrong. So spent what, 4 years? Yeah, 4 years at NASA, and then I got hired by the DCMA. So it went from the Defense Contract Management Command to its own agency by then.
Mm-hmm.
So during NavAir, Defense Contract Management Agency was the one leading the reviews instead of the services. But in the end, I joined DCMA and then served in 3 different areas under DCMA. And that started as a space and missile product lead and then became policy guy. And at the time we were the executive agent. I don't know if you all remember that. So we did a lot of good things. We brought EVM into DLA. I'm not sorry, DLA, it's Defense Contract Management Agency, which they split from the Defense Logistics Agency. At NavAir, we were still doing reviews because they were building the capability to do reviews, but they didn't have the capability. And then they decided they would allow contractors to pretty much take ownership. And that was the big thing. We need to allow the contractors to take ownership.
What year was that?
That was around, it was around all the same time. I'd say it was 2004, 2005.
Okay, yeah.
Time frame in there. Because right after I got to NavAir, the IG report came out. And that's what I want to get back to.
Okay,
Wait,
yeah.
wait. Let me just wrap up the bio because I and then we'll get into it because we're going to kick us off in a second here. So you got us up to DCMA and you were with DCMA, and I know a little tiny bit from one of our special recurring quasi third co-host, Daniel Goldsmith, that you worked with Daniel and that you were his lead. And that you and him did several reviews in Europe, which sounded as though you guys had a lot of.
But that's when I became the regional guy, manager, because we were broken into regions. First, it was products, and when I met Daniel, I was with the space and missile product lead, and I was also working out of NASA. I just switched my badge from a NASA badge to a DCMA badge, and they had a home for me there. And then when the shuttle program ended, because DCMA was there to test the rocket motor boosters, they said, "Well, Jim, you can just work from home." I'm like, "Great, that's great," But then later they said, well, we'll go ahead. When we broke into regions, they said, we're going to have an Orlando hub.
Mm.
Okay, that's not bad. But I still worked from home until they could get that thing going. And by the time they got it going, I mean, I retired and from civil service, and I started my consulting career. Did consulting for 14 years.
And that's where I met Jim, when you were, as you were consulting.
Yes. And I was consulting for both industry and government. I mean, I did some consulting for the Department of Energy, and then a lot of consulting for contractors that were undergoing reviews as well. So
a lot of really, really, as you were telling your bio, the thing that really stood out is that we got a lot of history on the development of EVMS. So very much appreciate that. Thank you, Jim. Okay, let's take us and pivot into some of where we want to talk about, like, we want to hear from you on the history of major events in the world of EVM. And we'll start, you said, I think pivotal timing is around 1993. So can you take us back?
That was an OIG report, an Office of Inspector General, DOD. And that came out following the A12. So a lot of you are familiar with the A12. It was a pivotal moment because so much importance was focused on CSCSC and the analysis portion of that. How this program, which was basically the Navy version of the Air Force F-117A, which was an interdiction bomber stealth, was canceled because of a few different things. One was I'd say the most important thing was the fact that while the contractor performance reports, and I can't remember whether they called them the cost performance report at the time, was showing that cost performance was going south, and the schedule variance was getting a lot bigger as well, in terms of its negative schedule variance. That there were increasing delays that was going to have an impact on the schedule, and following. What happened was there was a major aircraft review in Congress, and they were reviewing 4 major contracts, and one of them was the A12, and basically was Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense, told Congress that they were on schedule and they were on cost and there were no problems. But then following that, the CEOs of General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas, I think it was GD Fort Worth and McDonnell Douglas St. Louis, they went to Dick Cheney and they said, look, we're in a lot of trouble. What the DoD did was they scaled back on procurement quantities, and I think it's common knowledge that when that happens, because there's often a break-even point, and in this case, this was a fixed price incentive type contract. So once it went through ceiling, and after looking at some of those CPRs, the CPRs were showing that if you did your wind site analysis at the time, they were going to overrun it by probably another 100% more than they were.
Yeah.
And some say that they would have gone 200% more.
Wow.
It was all over. But it was one of those things where, okay, well, who knew what when, right?
Right.
And that's what I call the day of enlightenment, where you start figuring out, well, what went wrong. You start doing forensic accounting and stuff, and so there was an audit. There was an OIG audit on the A12 because that program ended up getting canceled for default. And it went many decades, I think, before they finally worked it out in court. But it was a pivotal moment because following that, John Betty, who was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, he commissioned another OIG audit which they looked at 9 major programs. And so I was at the plant representative office with one of the programs they mentioned, and I got to spend time with those guys. So those guys, the auditors, asked me a lot of questions, and I answered the best of my knowledge. And I think since I was one of the most experienced people, in terms of doing surveillance and being a chief of the surveillance branch, I gave them a lot of insight into some of the things that I was experiencing at APRO TRW, which was mainly, I told them, the issues we have here at TRW is we have all these different contractors, all these different contracts from various different program offices, and the review chiefs and the review directors would always ask TRW, that's not how we want things done in your system description. We want you to do something differently, right? So they were always writing up TRW, and TRW was, you only have one system, but they all wanted different things. So it got to the point where it was like, you know what, this is kind of crazy, because, you can't have just one system where you do things a specific way, because the customer wants, because of personalities and experience and other things, they wanted things done a different way. And so as a chief surveillance guy there, I was saying, well, that's not really a requirement. So you're imposing these requirements on their system that they're not going to be able to use anywhere else. So it's just on this program. But the procuring offices ruled the day. They had their own team chiefs, their own review directors, their own program managers that they needed to satisfy. And so that's what you got. You had one system that was torn many different ways. And I said, that's a major problem, drives the contractor crazy. So one of the things that you can do is consolidate this under the new Defense Contract Management command, and consolidate the review. I said the other thing is the reviews take roughly 3 years. Contractors validated, devalidated, then they have to get revalidated. But the problems, once the contractor has been validated, the problems really surface when all the emphasis on passing the review diminishes. And that's the surveillance portion of it. And that's where you start seeing a lot of problems, because you don't have the eyes and ears. Many experienced people trying to, encountering new situations, reviewing things, and giving good advice. And sometimes there's process changes required. Sometimes because even after 3 years of seeing a contractor, you go through different phases of the program, and things always change. You have new situations. It's always evolving. The review chiefs and directors tell you that. It's like, hey, you need to continue maintaining your system so that it continues to provide valid, accurate, timely data, right? So two things. One thing is the surveillance needs to be beefed up, because all you had in those days were GS-12s. You didn't have the grade that would incentivize someone to keep staying there, right? And so once the person became experienced, they would always go to one of the services, for space.
Is that a factor of how the military works, or is that a factor of how the civilian?
They were all civilians that were.
Okay.
In the military, it's up or out, and usually going up, you have to take a job that's totally unrelated to what you've been doing.
Yeah.
Because they're looking for people that have just a little bit of experience in a lot of different things, so that one day be a leader.
By design, it's like that.
By design, right? Yeah. But that wasn't my career, and I told the general that when I was up for major, He says, you don't have an operational assignment and this and that. And I'm like, yeah, that's because I really enjoy what I'm doing on this, and I'm very good at it. And so you need officers that are very good at something, right? And then
Nice.
that way he was like, no, we don't need people like you. I'm like, okay. We want leaders. And I'm like, well, I'm leading in my field. And he goes, well, that's not what we're interested in. So, so we would lose our really good people, and they would go off and do something else, and we'd have to start all over. And I said, if there's a career path within DCMA, then you're going to retain the knowledge. You're going to retain people that are really good, and then you're going to centralize a function which needs to be done. I mean, right now you have, and we used to have tri-service validations where you would, if in our, you would have tri-service reviews, but not always would you have tri-service members of that. But a tri-service review, a tri-service validation meant that it would go through the service focal points, because there was an EVM focal point in the Navy, Army, and Air Force, and so they had to sign off on it, and you had to provide all the information in these huge binders, for them to go over and to say, yay, verily, that's good. They demonstrated this, they demonstrated that. Stamp. But if someone didn't like, thought that either the information we were providing wasn't sufficient, they could kick it back.
Yeah.
And you'd have to go, get the information you needed. And that happened a few times, by the way. But for the most part, there was that, all the services had to agree, that this validation was good. And sometimes you didn't have that. Sometimes they said, well, this will never be a Navy type thing, or this will never be an Air Force type thing. We're just going to give an Army validation. But if the contractor wanted to get an Air Force contract with an Army validation, you had to have a tri-service validation. So they would have to do it all over again.
Wow, that is really history, because we're in 2026 now. That's 20 plus years ago when you had the tri-service or the single service validations going on. That is really in the history books now. Amber, correct me, but Jim, you told us that in this IG report, along with the career path trial and tribulation, you were going to tell us about the central. Oh, well, I guess you just haven't you? About the central organization, because then it turned to be
right. So the OIG, I talked to them. They said, "Hey, Jim, we need to do some of your recommendations in our report," and I'm like, "Sure." So they issued their audit report, and the title was "The Use of Contractor Cost and Schedule Control Systems Data."
And that's publicly available. Right.
The March 1993 report. Because of DoD concerns about management oversight on cost schedule performance on major DoD acquisition programs, was conducted on 9 programs, like I mentioned, following the 812 program cancellation due to issues with government oversight and contractor cost overruns and schedule delays. So, being a pivotal moment, the IG report went to, all the OSD EVM guys. There was an exchange of we agree, we disagree, we agree. But what happened in the end, it resulted in consolidating the responsibility for validating CSC or EVM systems from the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, to the Defense Contract Management Command, and then later to the agency, which followed that. It also created a policy requirement to review the sufficiency of performance measurement baselines. But at the time,
the IBR?
Yes, the IBR. So, but that was one of their recommendations.
That was one of the OIG recommendations from '93.
It wasn't being done adequately or sufficiently.
Or was it called an IBR before that time?
No, it wasn't called that. It was that. There was something called the Joint Implementation Guide, 1987, and in there it gave allowances for a baseline review. But a baseline review was supposed to be conducted in lieu of a SAR, right? The idea there was you were going to do a demonstration review, and for each subsequent contract, and this is smart because with each subsequent contract, Normally you have a new group of people, right? And they hire a bunch of new people to do a new contract. And so you have a lot of inexperience there. And a subsequent application review is to make sure that you were following your system description and implementing it in accordance with, all the process and controls, and that was validated. I think if you remember in DCMA, we said a system is process, people, tools, right?
And culture, but yes.
A set of people,
yeah,
you can't be sure that they're going to operate a validated system, because people is the big part of it. Same goes with the process. If you switch to a new, if you consolidate your operation under a different company, that would require another review, because they have their own processes. You have new people, new tools.
Right.
So anyways,
Jim, I'm going to kind of regroup and get us to the results. We're getting closer on time, so want to get us through.
Okay, wait.
No, but let me recap just for everyone, so make sure I'm hearing it too. So the results of the IG report, you said we're consolidating the EVM into one. So that was 1. 2, you were talking about changing the policy requirements. That
reviews
sufficiency for baseline.
And then third, which I didn't mention, was establishment of incentives for implementing and maintaining EVM systems, including criteria for withdrawal of system approvals, and a contract clause contractor payment withhold for failure to adequately
implement. All right. That came out of the IG report, the withhold?
Yes. Yeah. But they were recommending a 10% withhold. Now, what DCMA did on the withholds is it said, we're going to do, because once we joined DCMA, the EVM guys, right? When we became, first of all, DCMA was pretty much led by contracts people. Okay, so if you were a contracting officer, held a very high esteemed position, right? The next one was quality. So quality and contracts were very important things. EVM came in, and people were like, "What the hell?" Right? They didn't know what to do with EVM, but it became a business. It was a business system.
It got elevated to become a business system.
Right. But it also EVM has crossovers, right, to a lot of different things.
Oh yeah.
But that's a different topic. The interesting part in this is that 10% became the maximum you could withhold out of all the different business systems. But if you had one business system, the maximum you could withhold was 5%. Okay. So the 5%, the 10% stayed, and it was, hey, we still want to. But having said that, that was a separate clause. But you didn't really need a separate clause, because there were other means of withholding payments for non-performance, and so that some contracting officers knew that, some services knew that, and they would actually there was a white paper written by Jim Rigo, who teaches at DSMC down in San Diego, and he wrote a paper on remedies for contractual remedies for noncompliance. Anyways, but then it said the report identified the following issues, right? System reviews were not timely or consistently and effectively conducted. The system and oversight of validated systems were not accomplished in an effective or efficient manner. The sufficiency of baselines was not adequately determined early in the contract during EVM reviews. A lot of people don't know this, but when I worked at Hanscom Air Force Base for the Air Force, we would actually, in our subsequent application reviews, we would review the baselines. That was extremely important, and we would take technical people, and all of us would be conducting an EVM review. But the baseline was a big part of that, okay? So we would bring technical people to assist us in determining whether or not the earned value methods were good, with whether the requirements were all identified to the degree they needed to be identified. I mean, now they split that. Why? Because OSD thought it was a good idea to do that, right? And I was sitting at NavAir going, that is a horrible idea to do that. And they took example from the Army, and they took an example from BMDO, and they said BMDO is doing it right. Well, BMDO actually had done exactly what Hanscom Air Force was doing, Air Force Base, which they were using technical guys as well. So, but then, they said, we're going to do away with SARs because SARs are not important anymore. And we were like, are you, when SARs when they're not important anymore because the contractors got it down, we'll do a baseline review. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do anyways, right? but that was the history. So if there's a history of good performance in terms of meeting, your processes and controls and being able to demonstrate that, then we would say, well, we don't need to do a full SAR anymore, right? On the next contract, we'll just do a baseline review. So that's just a little heads up for you guys. And then finally, the system data could not be relied upon in the acquisition decision making process. So why was the data being ignored, right? Even though the data was showing that. But I will go one step further, right? Because the blame really resides or begins with the contractor, right? The contractor wasn't putting in his or her reports that estimate at completion, given a good, reliable estimate at completion, which is one of the criteria, right? One of the criteria, one of the guidelines, EACs, of course, several management, I would say, organizations have tried to take that out and say that's a program office function. It's like, no, the program offices will suppress that, and try to hide it as long as they can until some opportune moment.
Oh boy.
Well, I think the question, Amber, is on Amber's lips is, we named this episode "Challenges Remain."
Oh yeah,
Jim, what do you see? Like, has anybody learned anything? Am I wrong, Amber?
Before you go, Jim, I do want to say I've heard throughout Jim's telling of what has happened and where things have come from and have gone. I hear a lot of challenges that are persisting through all of that.
Yes.
So
I would say one of our greatest challenges, because we have made a lot of headway, by the way. I think in the DDMs, with the metrics, the data-driven metrics, but there still are a lot of challenges even with those, right? What I say is all metrics that are looked at, they are in fact detective. In other words, something has already happened that may or may not be a problem, right? It's just it's a metric that says, hey, you need to go look at this. It's not an automatic, that's bad data because something tripped a metric, right? Of course, a lot of people forget that, but the fact is that you need to go look at it and then decide, how's it affecting the data, right? Because that's what's important. The things so in terms of the challenges, you can start all the way at policy, right? Every time someone gets their hands on a DoD interpretive guide, or for example, the DOE interpretive guide, well, it's not a guide anymore, right? And then does something to it, right? Sometimes you get policies that are overly prescriptive. You get policies that don't make any sense, but then those get ingrained in, well, you have to do this. And it's like, and the contractors will do anything you tell them, right? Some of them will go, well, that's ridiculous, but they want to pass the review. And so they're not going to confront and argue with the customer. Okay. They just won't do it. And of course, as consultants have to keep our mouth shut, right? because we want to make them happy, and that's how everyone makes them happy. But yeah, there's policies that need to be looked at from outside the organization. Needs to come in, because when you're inside an organization, you can't criticize anything, right? Because,
Yeah.
someone signed it, the boss signed it, and no one wants him to look bad, okay? So, but that has to be done, and that should always be done. And those things should always be challenged, okay? Because until everyone really understands why that stuff is in there, right? If it makes any sense.
Yeah.
Here's what happens, right? The reason why they say that we rely on the data, if you go back to analysis, and I was in the analysis shop for almost 10 years, right? What happens? We use the CPI and SPI to say, given the CPI and SPI, among other things, right? This is what the range of relevant EACs, estimates at completion, you're looking at. So you're saying it could be this bad or it could be this good, right? But we use those as a factor to budget remaining, right? Work remaining. Look past can be prologue, doesn't necessarily have to be, but if you're getting C's on a report card and you've gone 3/4 of the C, you're not going to make an A, right? You'll probably make a B, but you're not going to make an A, right?
Yep.
So on your 4th quarter. But that's the kind of thing that's really important. And because we do use those. So, but what needs to be done is that analyst, which I'm finding a lack of EVM analysts that do cost analysis, right? In support of a program office, in support of a command or procuring activity, because you as an analyst has to be able to tell a program manager, his boss, the command authorities, that this is what I believe the EAC is. So, but in order to do that, you need to be part of that program office, right? But you need to be apart from it.
Breach. I mean, that's the whole thing. You can't just look at the performance data. You have to be in the house.
Right. You have to be in the house.
I've been asked, like, here, Barbara, can't you run the critical path yourself?
And you have to communicate.
No, as a matter of fact, I can't. Can I find the path with the least total slack? Sure, like click, whatever. But that's not what it is. You have to have the content. You have to have the context. You have to be embedded, to your point.
And that's one of the things NavAir was really good at. And that's why we became a premier organization, grew to over 100 people, just doing analysis, right? And supporting the programs and having all these team chiefs that knew systems. But the interesting thing is, if you look at Winsight and it says, look at these anomalies, right? Okay, well, what do you do with those anomalies, right? Well, if you're going to go do EACs at a lower level, you're going to want to say, well, does this really represent the efficiency, the cost efficiency? If you have some anomalies that are now changing the cost efficiency, maybe it's not 95% efficient, maybe it's only 90% efficient, right? So if you go in there and start using those anomalies to change the results, because they're not predicting or they're not projecting if you followed all the disciplines and all the controls and all the processes, you wouldn't end up with that efficiency factor, right? What would you end up with? If you take those out, the anomalies out, you end up with a different efficiency factor. Now you can apply that to your budgeted cost for work remaining. And then say, given the performance to date, if I continue along this line and even look at trends, this is really the efficiency factor that I want to use. Now, if you take SPI times CPI, you're going to, and the SPI is a negative, it's going to draw down that CPI. But there's other ways of reaching the same conclusion. But that's one of the things I did at NavAir. I would say, you know what? When I'm doing my CPI, SPIs, I'm taking out all the anomalies and say, you know what? This is really the true efficiency, both in schedule and in cost for this period of time. And so then I could say, given the trends and given the times it happens, this is probably where it's going to end up at. And I was very successful at that, and I was the first to do that at Naval Air Systems Command. But that's not the only thing that is going to lead you to. I mean, you need to communicate all the technical stuff, and you need to get a handle on things, and you need to use risk. And risk is the other thing.
Ooh, that's a big one. That's a big one. I'd love to open up that door
Yeah, we'll have to
in
talk
later episodes. Yes.
So anyways, and then I would say that customers and contractors alike, a lot of them still see EVMS or EVM as a reporting requirement. They don't use it as an effective tool for cost, schedule, and technical management decision making. And so that's the challenge. That's a huge challenge. How do you get a contractor to do that? You can have the best system in the world. It gives you the best data in the world. But if you're not using it for management decisions.
Amber and I are going to solve that riddle with this podcast, Jim.
Right?
Yes.
That's one of
Well,
our goals.
I've got a lot of ideas on that. But suffice to say that both the contractor first, because that's utmost important. I mean, you pay them to manage this, right? But it's also the government. The government also needs to be involved, because the government, once the contractor brings that stuff to the light, now the government has to do something about it, right? You got three things you can do about it, right? You can add more money, you can add more time, or you can change the technical requirements, right? And so it comes down to that. It all comes down to that. That's the decision-making process, right? So the next topic. So the validation thing is very important. And if you're not doing it right, then it's going to fail, right? Okay. So next is surveillance is risk-based now, right?
Yeah.
Why is it risk-based? Because they've made a lot of changes. They've taken people out of the plants. They put them in organizations. I mean, that's DCMA for you, right? We're centralized the organization. It's like, really? Okay. Well, you need someone there communicating with the people always. It would be great if you could communicate that with the program offices and communicate with the contractors, have meetings where you're giving your analysis, right? But I don't, it's like, but in that kind of analysis, you need to do analysis of the schedule, and you need to do analysis of the cost. I mean, that's the most important thing. It's like, where are we headed, guys? Where are we? But this surveillance thing, what does tiered prioritization mean to you guys? I mean, really what it is we don't have enough people to do this, so we're going to do less, right? But we're going to do it based on risks, right? And so what do they do for risks? They say, oh, well, we've got 75% of our cars have been on these DDMs, right? 75% of our cars have been on these guidelines, right? And so it's like, okay, right? It's like, so we're going to do these at least once every 3 years. It's like, what? It's like, you ought to be doing a set of metrics, especially the automated ones, monthly, because you get them monthly, it's not a problem, right? Feed them into the automated tool, boom, it pops out. Now, if you get something that says, I'm an anomaly, yeah, you want to pay attention to that, because if it becomes 2 months or 3 months of anomaly, now it affects the CPI, the current, and it affects the 3-month CPI, which you may be using in an EAC, right? So that's just bad juju, right? I think it's
Finally, we get to the heart of things. Bad juju.
It just hasn't been adequately addressed. You need to address surveillance effectively. You need to be on top of it every month, the stuff that you can be, and the stuff that you can't be, or the stuff, you do periods of time where you're going to focus on those as well, right? So I still think that by relaxing on surveillance, first it's policy, right? Policy may not be good, but then surveillance, hey, you're still, if you're not looking at it and making sure that they're doing things in accordance with their system, that they're doing things right, the discipline falls apart. You end up with a system that's providing you meaningless data because they're breaking so many rules that the customer can't use the data to project reliable EACs or schedule forecasts.
I think that's I'm feeling good, Jim. That might be the final ending, that you do need to have the discipline. That's one thing that we don't talk too much about in EVM in this podcast, is that I think part of the reason there's so much passion is because that it is a very disciplined
It's management.
practice.
It's control. It's control.
It's control, project controls, right? And that
control,
takes
right?
discipline in order.
Yeah.
You have to have strength
lost
to do
control.
that.
You know, they
Yeah.
weren't reporting it either. So,
Yeah.
anyways.
Yeah, I like the history. I like hearing the journey. But I also have worked with Jim for quite some time, and I enjoy the passion that he has behind his stories. So thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it as well.
It's been a lot of fun, guys.
All right.
And that's it from
Let's talk
EVMS.